All right, welcome back to the next stage of our education and still really the virtual exodus, as that is the ultimate problem.
Reversing the virtual exodus.
Reversing the virtual exodus. The virtual, what's the opposite of exodus? Is there a
I don't know. In Latin, it'll be reditus. Because like in the Neoplatonic scheme is exitus and then reditus. So this,
Okay.
the virtual reditus, I don't know.
Yeah, that has a ring to it. I think what I really wanted to talk about today is the role of specialization in education. Because I recently picked up a very interesting book. I'd heard about this guy a lot, just the name around, and he's famous for the Geodesic Dome. But this guy, Buckminster Fuller, I just recently picked up his book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, which I feel like should get a gold star for title choice alone. I mean, I'm not gonna like see a book with that title and not say I want to know what this is. And I'm really only in the beginning. I just started it just this week, but right off the bat, he rips into the idea of specialization as being the death of a species when it becomes hyper specialized, and he essentially says that is what we need to avoid if we're going to survive. He's one of these people that's trying to forecast future trends and predict mankind's future and try to forecast what it will need to do, what we will need to do in order to adapt to the way that we are changing the world. So he comes up a lot now because there's so many different angles that people are looking at for ways that we are seemingly approaching exhausting certain natural resources where we may be influencing the climate and actually dealing with the effects of that in terms of fires and floods, the way that we're managing our natural resources, etc. That there does seem to be like humanity is approaching a time where technologically there's going to have to be some big shifts to the next level soon. And so he's one of the guys that comes up a lot in those kind of circles because he advocated broad systems thinking and seeing how everything interlocked with everything else. And he did an enormous amount of research himself. He's an autodidact to the extreme, and he knew a substantial amount of the technical aspects of what he was talking about. But his goal was always to unite everything and have a metaphysical theory of everything in the concrete world in order for mankind to see what the solutions would be and how to adapt. And he argues that that's our best quality is our adaptability and our cognitive adaptability. And that really struck a chord with me because it makes sense that when you see the position of humanity, that we do use our minds to both adapt to the environment and then, if we are successful at that, adapt the environment to us to serve our needs. And that we can live in essentially any climate, any position, and that we continue, with spurts or with stops and starts, but we do continuously seem to improve and build on the inventions of previous eras and just continually make new and better things around us, which alter the environment in our favor and allow us to control the environment to a substantial degree. And he argues that clearly the opposite of that is specialization. And he tries to point to naturalistic examples where he gives a story of this certain type of bird that lived in marshlands, and over time, due to climate change at that time, the marshes began receding due to lower and lower rain, and so natural selection selected for birds with longer beaks so they could continue to reach down into the marshlands, into this more shallower and shallower water. And he said eventually this continues over generations, and eventually you end up with birds with these huge beaks that are perfect for that highly specific situation. But then there's recorded records of this massive fire where all the marshland burned, and apparently these birds' beaks were so large and so heavy that they could no longer fly. So there was no way that they could escape from this fire in the marsh, and they all died. And that's his striking example of how becoming overfitted to particular circumstances makes you exceedingly fragile, because you're everything about your adaptation is dependent on your environment remaining within a very narrow band of conditions. And you can see that with a lot of apex predators in nature, that, you know, a saber-toothed tiger is much more fragile than rabbits or rats or cockroaches. There's just many more layers of things that have to be going right in order for an animal like that to maintain itself than there does for cockroaches, where essentially nothing really has to be going right except organic matter falls to the ground. So this is switching a little bit more into kind of a technological progress way of viewing education. But I think since it's an unavoidable aspect of our lives, it makes sense that we would look to it both perhaps to learn about the importance of specialization, and vice versa, that maybe the fact that that's what we're presented with necessitates generalization and the seeing, the noting of how the web all interweaves. And one more note on him I think that would be interesting to talk about is I've heard of movements recently where people are trying to discuss, like, how can we structure education to generate polymaths like Buckminster Fuller, like Leonardo da Vinci and Ben Franklin, these guys that just have this wild inventiveness and ability to incorporate everything that they learned and saw into these impactful, concrete creations, which influenced the course of history. But then the question that people raise when they're saying, yeah, we really need to try to like produce these guys to save civilization. But it's like, well, do you know any of the stuff that Da Vinci looked at or what Buckminster Fuller looked at? It's like, well, no. And and then the question that I've heard people raise this about, this guy named Daniel Schmachtenberger, was very interesting systems thinker, was talking about this. And the question is like, so if you don't have any idea what would be going into this, what makes you think that you're going to be able to harness and manage these guys in your service? Because maybe you could do that in more ancient times when technology was much more simple and everything was evident to the senses. Fuller talks about this. And, you know, a really sharp individual, a king or a warlord who was just sharp with his senses, could kind of tell if he was being bullshitted or not. And he could understand, at least when his technical wizards would explain something to him, he'd say, yeah, okay, I can see how that would work. But now that everything's so immaterial, the question is like, could non-polymath educated people understand how to manage and harness that power? Or would you end up with these guys going rogue or something like that too? So that's a lot to chew on right there. But I found it interesting, and I thought it would be fitting to bring in something a little bit more in the technological material realm, because education is going to, of necessity, ultimately be interacting with the material world too. We've kind of focused more on the philosophical side of it, or kind of the spiritual or meaning side of it. But I think also having a concrete effect in a productive and creative way with the tangible world is also an aspect of meaning. And I think the video games bring that out too, that you're seeing a tangible result for your action, an immediate jolt of satisfaction that your idea came to life.
Yeah. Well, so especially because
I see what you think about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, technology, the weird thing about technology that I remember talking to some people who kind of scared me not too long ago. They said they were having a discussion group on the Unabomber manifesto.
Yeah, I meant to go to that. I've actually read that. It's pretty good, I thought. It always sounds bad to say it, but it was pretty good.
I'd like to read it. I just don't want to buy it on Amazon lest I get flagged or something.
I thought about that too. I bought it on Kindle so nobody would see me reading it either.
Well, see, the thing is, it perplexes me, and I am going somewhere with this. It's not just me rambling, but I think that we too often think of technology as something added to the world, but for every generation that actually in which the production of technology, of a technological advance is made, obviously, yes, it is experienced as something added to the world, but for every subsequent generation, it's a given part of the world.
Uh-huh.
And if part of the goal of meaning is, if what you're looking for with meaning is trying to make sense of the world around you as you perceive it, then necessarily that's going to involve having to make sense of, and having to understand by way of, find a narrative to explain the presence of and significance of the technology that surrounds you. So I think that even if you were to focus on education as primarily the cultivation of a meaningful life, you have to at some point in time confront the influence of technology. So I agree with that impulse. I'm interested though in because first I want to talk about specialization as you presented it, as you presented Buckminster Fuller presenting it, before I kind of talk about how I think it relates to education, because it's interesting that he would think specialization is the death of civilization, because I don't know what I think about this. I don't know where I stand on either side, but I know people who would say that actually, I mean, there's that class of economists who would say the division of labor is the beginning of civilization. And it seems like the division of labor is fundamentally a matter of specialization. This guy's better at doing this, that guy's better at doing that. And I'm not saying that, go on, what was your...
No, I think perhaps, I mean, I should temper that. I think he's really saying over specialization, but he's saying what the loss of individuals who are capable of actually understanding how all the pieces fit together, because is really what the death of civilization is, because he argues that, again, in more ancient times, a smart king was trained from his youngest years to understand how all the aspects of the kingdom fit together, and all the different wise men and advisors. He understood, where each one was coming from. But those guys were highly specialized in one particular area. They knew everything about the finance of the city, minting gold, coinage, all that kind of stuff. Maybe another was the minister of war or whatever. But he emphasizes that it seems that a good king is one who makes sure that nobody knows all the sides of the story so that he can maintain his power. And they talk about that with, like, when they're sharing like classified information with people in the military. I think it's often narrowed down to, like, this is the thing you need to know to do your job related to this. And they don't want everybody knowing all the full picture. They don't, so that way that they can maintain power and control of the system. So he's saying that without anybody that is capable of doing something like that, of understanding how it all fits together and directing it, you end up with people that have just been in these narrow tunnels trying to make decisions about the whole, but they don't have the type of holistic thinking that somebody in the position of a king would have. So I think that tempers it a little bit, but he really does, but he does strongly lean towards generalization over specialization, because he thinks that often it's too hard to, once you've gone down that road, it's very hard to undo it and become specialized, because you're like, this is what got us to this point. Or if in the case of an individual, like, this is what got me my plus position in society. I'm not going to turn my back on this. I'm committed to this. So maybe that'll temper it a little bit. But
it does temper it a little bit. It does, though, seem like, I don't know. I mean, even the example of it's a tough line, and you have to walk a very thin line, because, well, on the one hand, I think it's true that a degree of anti-fragility or a degree of adaptability are important, and I think often more important than being tailored to specific tasks. On the other hand, just to kind of stick with the natural selection example that you gave of the bird, it's clear you can have an overly specified organism that's tailored to one very specific thing. On the other hand, though, if you're like, think of microorganisms. I think Stephen Jay Gould once said, interestingly, that we tend to think of more complex organisms as that's the aim of nature. And in some ways it's true, but he said simplicity also has its charms. And he pointed out that there are just the largest number of species in the world of living things happen to be microorganisms, which have not appreciably changed really as species in millions, if not billions of years.
Yeah.
But the obvious caveat to that is they're simple in the sense of, in what he means by simple, which is, they're not large, and they're not adapted to eating only one kind of thing in one kind of environment. So on the one hand, they last forever and they can endure a lot, but that's because there's simply less going on there. They're not to say that they're less interesting in the sense that they're boring. I'm sure they're quite fascinating, but
Yeah.
they're less interesting at the level of variation and adaptation to specific situations is almost what makes an organism fascinating. And it seems like you're only going to get, more complicated, more harmonious, more fascinating, and more marvelous organisms through a long process of adaptation. And in order to even get adaptation in the first place, you need to have a sufficient number of at least considerable variations. And if one of those variations happens to be what fits in a given circumstance, and that's what's going to survive, but it's not going to stay that way. It's going to constantly be varying. Like, that seems, obviously I know that Darwin's theory has been augmented a lot, but that's one of his fundamental points, is that variation, the combination of variation with the struggle for existence is what really produces the phenomenon of natural selection. And with the overall thing producing the phenomenon of evolution. So it seems like, from the standpoint of species survival, which it sounds like you're saying, Fuller emphasizes the need for generalist thinking rather than overly specific thinking. In order for the survival of the species to be something that you're really going to be able to have in the long term, he's insisting on generalization. And while that's true, there's also the flourishing of the species, because it seems, I don't know, I'm not, because I side much more with, at one point in time, someone in the Platonic school, I've not read the dialogue, it's a very short dialogue, but there's a dialogue called Rival Lovers by Plato, or at least nominally by Plato, where it's evident that he's taking on, whoever it is criticizing Aristotle's school, because Aristotle was of the opinion that an educated man should be acquainted with at least the principles of all the known sciences. And Plato thought, or at least this person speaking for Plato, and I think Plato, at least in principle, was of the opinion that, well, no, everybody should master, I think he even says several times in the Republic, everybody should master one thing that they're really good at. No one could possibly master all, which is one of the reasons, and that kind of goes into his somewhat totalitarian republic that he devises further and further on in that particular book. So I definitely side more with Aristotle in that. I think having an acquaintance with the general is generally better or more important. But on the other hand, I don't think you want to emphasize that to the point where you downgrade the fact that variation and specificity are also motors of adaptation. So obviously you need a balance of both. And obviously you're going to see that same need for balance between specialization and generality when you're talking about education as well.
I think that is true. I think when I reflect on my perception of education at this moment, though, I do tend to sense that there's almost a monomania about specialization at this point, to the point where it's almost where like liberal arts is again becoming hip, because there's so few people that have that quality of being able to connect multiple genres. I wouldn't say it's really at the stage of being truly hip yet, but you see a few articles float across here and there about like the merits of liberal arts grads as compared to these over specialized people. So it seems like there's a need for it, and that, even though Fuller, you could kind of read that as him maybe not necessarily believing that 100% to be the case, that obviously you can only have generalists, that doesn't seem feasible, but perhaps being fiery in order to light a fire under American society in particular, to be like, look, we need people who can actually put this all together again. But it does raise the same difficulty that Plato mentions, and it's even more remarkable that since he said it at a time when technology was not even a shadow of what it is now, that no one can comprehend everything.
Mm.
And I think that's all the more the case at this moment. And I think even there's a really interesting like story I heard about how Goethe was considered to be the last one who knew everything, the last real polymath, and because the world just got too complex after that for any one person to know it all, to understand how the whole thing fit together. So
Yeah.
that's another wrinkle I think that came to mind to me when after reading Fuller, is that have we gotten to the point, and it would influence the structure of an educational system, is have we gotten to the point where the world is just too complicated for somebody to be able to attain that polymath, all-encompassing wisdom and insight that Fuller's talking about?
Yeah,
And
I don't know if I want to say it's impossible. I think that it's perhaps easy to romanticize about how many polymaths there really have been in the world in history.
mhm,
I mean, I think Plato and Aristotle, I think, would qualify as having been polymaths of their age. Um, I imagine, I don't know the names, but I'm confident there are comparable sages in the East and in the Middle East. You know, at the height of the Islamic civilization, like in Persia.
yeah,
Um, and you know, there are several polymaths, you know, here scattered here and there over the last 2,000 years in Europe, but they've always been an extreme minority,
mhm,
precisely because the world has always been complicated. I think it depends on what it means. I think we have so much more information about the world available
yeah,
that because of that, it seems as though no one could possibly master it all. But I think it's enough for someone to be interested in knowing it all, and at least in principle capable of carrying those interests to real fruition. They don't have to master every bit of information. I think we have
yeah,
a that's a whole subject for an episode in its own of the epistemological assumptions in referring to knowledge as largely information.
sure, yeah,
Because I think that actually does kind of affect what it would mean for someone to be a pilot. Oh, they know everything. They're basically a walking encyclopedia. I think that's impossible. But I think that kind of going back to Aristotle's ideal, he says it in on the first. It's in the first few chapters of his book, The Parts of Animals, where he talks about.
I love when those like prime nuggets are buried in some more random work. Yeah,
I know you're like, well, oh, okay. Um,
yeah,
Well, he's actually in that work. He's actually talking about specialization in particular because he's moving to the specifics of what he would have understood as biology at the
okay,
time. But he begins with saying, you know, before we get specific, if you're really going to be educated about something and not be a proficient, at least being educated means knowing the principles of the science. I think that the idea of knowledge being kind of a large tree in which there's sort of the trunk and the roots and then ever more specific branches of conclusions kind of getting further and further away from the trunk. That's a very different way of looking at knowledge than thinking of knowledge as largely compounded bits of information. I think that
yeah,
Aristotle's ideal is what every polymath always has been, is someone who knows the principles of things, who knows the principles of the various sciences and modes of knowing, and is equipped. It has the ability, has the natural talent to be able to sufficiently consider those principles and bear them out to their conclusions.
yeah,
Um, which, I mean, that raises an interesting question of which. Well, maybe the information subject will have to be treated here, because it seems like, here's what I'm thinking, that if we want to talk about how specialization is going to relate to education,
mhm,
then and maybe think about how can education get closer to producing the kind of people that would be a Buckminster Fuller or a Goethe. Like, kind of going back to what you were saying, so what, do you know the things that would make you a polymath? It's like, well, maybe that's not the best way of going around it. Maybe you have to reach a consensus about what it means for someone to be a polymath, and that in turn is going to mean you're going to have to talk about, well, what would it mean for someone to be a polymath? Okay, well then, what does it mean to know anything at all? Because that would bring you know, I'm kind of rambling, but I think that you would have to talk about knowledge as information versus knowledge as a network or a body of conclusions drawn from certain principles.
Yeah, that's interesting because it almost is a point in favor of specialization that, like, Fuller uses the example of like Einstein discovering E equals mc squared as the kind of thing that we need to be looking for, and that the polymath is somebody who knows those things, those like metaphysical laws, or I guess the natural laws, but he uses the term metaphysical laws. That someone who is a master of those, like you were saying, would be the ideal polymath, the ideal leader. However, what comes to mind for me is coming to mind right now is that typically the only way those formulas are discovered is by somebody who is hyper specialized and is continuing to explore on the outskirts of a body of knowledge. And even though
Mhm.
somebody like Einstein still seemed like he made broad connections, he spent most of his time working on physics by himself at the frontier, just poking around and seeing what he could find. And that's not the kind of thing that a generalist is going to be able to do. And I think the structure of our current scientific industrial complex, the science of, or the business of studies and research, is essentially the same way. You have these hyper specialists just poking around, trying things at the fringes of what we know, and then you're hoping that they'll make some discovery which is useful. So, but even then, you still need somebody general in order to understand how to incorporate that discovery into a way that doesn't destroy the balance of everything else, the ecosystem. But it is a point in favor of hyperspecialization that those principles are usually discovered by somebody working alone on the outskirts, or the classic image of Apple and Microsoft starting in garages in the Bay Area. They were not in the mainstream. Those were people specializing in what was then a hyper niche exploration with the personal computer. So I don't know. That kind of throws a wrench in the mix that you would almost need to find a way to, because I think it's reasonable to say both of those things are necessary at this point, but the education for those two is going to be very different.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting because it seems like we kind of have to. I think we need to tie some things back together and try to summarize where we've been, because I think that from the standpoint of achieving technological discovery and making technological advances,
Yeah,
yes, you need to be specialized.
yeah,
But should education be primarily concerned with producing scientific advancement, or it seems like that kind of runs in some tension with what we were saying in the last two episodes about
mm-hmm.
education should aim for a meaningful life. And it seems like what we're saying now is that if education is meant to cultivate the kinds of people who can make scientific and technological discoveries, then it seems like education is fundamentally aiming at some kind of practical modification of the world, and implicitly is aiming at the future. Whereas, at least the impression I got from the last two conversations we had was that education is chiefly concerned with assimilating the past for the sake of the present.
Yeah,
And it seems like there's some tension in the way we're thinking about it. Is it two things? One, education, as we were understanding it before, was about meaning, and implicitly, therefore, about making sense of the world in a kind of spiritual or at least existential way.
mm-hmm.
And it was about appropriating the past. Now it seems like what we're saying, education with an eye towards advancement, would be education with an eye not towards sort of making one's peace with being, but actually changing being. And it makes it implicitly more about the future than about the present. It's dissatisfied with the present, and it wants to bring in something which doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I felt like we had focused more on the meaning and the cultivation of that sense of meaning, whatever that is, and what would go into that. what it occurred to me that we hadn't really touched on the necessary fact of science. And I think what is interesting that he raises even just in the early pages of this work is the idea that we're the kind of species that is going to make technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a recognition that technology is going to happen. Like it's what we do just by nature. We make things to try to make the environment better and to work to our advantage. And so it's going to happen regardless. Part of a meaningful life is understanding how to integrate the power that is being unlocked through scientific discovery within a larger frame that holds everything together, in which the place of technology is clear. And I think that it's unavoidable. You want to be able to connect the past to the present and understand the threads of where things are going. But one of those threads necessarily is technology and where civilization is going. Because at the end of the day, if you can't preserve civilization and one that allows the good life to exist or even causes it to flourish, the bottom line is if it collapses and everyone dies, then the whole project is through. And so an ability to handle the technology that is produced is crucial. And that seems like something that we have to factor in, because we also need to think about like where what he calls spaceship Earth is going. Like, how does the whole thing work? And we need to understand how it does so that we can serve the interests of all and raise the level of the possibility of a meaningful life. Because I think, below a certain level of subsistence capacity, it does become difficult to achieve a meaningful life, in extreme poverty and hardship. So that's a material focus of it. But I think that is something that reliably gives people meaning, is alleviating suffering for others through ideas. And so I wanted to kind of like bring that into discussion to see how that might fit with the meaning making and the metaphysical side, because it's not purely just like focusing on the potential downfalls in the future, but that is a necessary concern of the intellectual life, is trying to preserve, maybe not even the intellectual life serving biological life and preserving the species so that it can continue realizing more and greater meaning. Like there has to be this bedrock of thinking about how to make it survive and thrive.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like it really it's a touchstone for one of the major, or several of the major differences between the classical way of looking at the world and the modern way of looking at the world. Because to the classical mind, it seems like how do I put it? I mean, you think of Plato or Aristotle again as kind of the emblems of the classical era, or at least or the fountainheads of Hellenism.
Love that. Yeah. Okay.
It seems like for them, what they're thinking of is that it's almost the city, or the political life is much more about securing perpetuity for the life you lead together. But the life of philosophy, the life of learning and education, precisely because it requires sort of a stepping back. There's a degree to which the learned life, or the life in which you're really trying to understand the world, you do kind of have to stand still while the world kind of does its thing, so you can get it, so you can kind of take in the whole phenomena. And in that respect, there's a timelessness about the truth you're seeking. And that necessarily puts you in some tension with political life. And I mean, I think you see that with Plato. Socrates is killed because he is deemed wrongly, I think, to be harmful to Athenian society.
Yeah.
Aristotle has, in the ethics, he has, in the later portions of the Nicomachean ethics, he talks about, to some extent, the life of the philosopher is the life of moral virtue is the life that's going to bring you towards the political good, but at least in practice, the intellectual life is often somewhat isolating. I think he even says somewhere in the Metaphysics, he says that the philosopher is always somewhat at odds with the political good, because when he's talking about politics has sort of dressed up what philosophy has discovered about the gods, about the celestial beings. It's kind of dressed them up for political gain. And Aristotle's like, yeah, they don't really look like us, and they're not lascivious the way we are, but by telling those stories, you can get the many to do what you want. So there's kind of an implicit tension that I think even the Stoics don't see inherently a contradiction between, think of Marcus Aurelius. You can be a philosopher and a political leader, but there's to some extent an indifference. It's irrelevant to the philosopher in the Stoic mind whether he's a great leader like Marcus Aurelius or an ex-slave like Epictetus, because the philosopher aspires to be a their whole idea of being a cosmopolitan, being a citizen of the world, citizen of the universe. So for them, there is really for the classical pre-modern mind, there is kind of a tension, they admit, between political life, the political good, and the intellectual life and the intellectual good. Whereas the modern society seems to think that that education and learning are only good to the extent that they actually contribute overall to the political good. I mean, the origin of research universities, the general technological thrust of science, and modern science, seems to definitely be proving the worth of what we know by what we can do based on that. And it seems, because I'm not going to lie, when I was in the last 2 episodes, when I was thinking of education, I was definitely drawn. I mean, I think I even probably quoted Aristotle more than anybody else. Sure. But I definitely think that the way we were presenting meaning, it might not be as simple as what I'm trying to say, to shift from the existential spiritual side of education and meaning to the technological side, because what we're really running into is a major civilizational rift in the relation between what it means to be learned and what it means to be a citizen. Because it's difficult. It's not impossible maybe, but it's difficult for me to imagine someone being initiated into a relatively stable sense of norms, values, and narrative if the world, because the world is always changing, but there's a stability to it. There's more stability to it, I think, than maybe we realize. Mm-hmm. And the goal of technology, the goal of science in some ways, definitely more technology, is to modify the order of things. So it seems like it's difficult if you're educating with an eye towards technological contribution and sort of the relief of suffering. To some extent, you're going to be actively changing, and even if you're intending to improve, you're going to be actively changing the world, perhaps in more ways than it's ever been changed existentially before, for people. And that's going to, I think, affect their ability to kind of imbibe and live under a given set of norms and values and a sense of narrative, precisely because if technology is if technology is allowed to do its thing without restraint, if it's sort of the main thing we're after, you can't take anything as given then. So if givenness is part of that sort of like naive experience of meaning that we were talking about in the last episode, is actually important for the acquisition of meaning and it's sort of gaining access to meaning and truth, then it seems like there's going to be some tension with the technological impulse, precisely because the technological impulse is dissatisfied with things as they are, because otherwise you wouldn't be trying to change them.
Yeah, I guess one way you could phrase it, though, is perhaps it is realizing what's real and unchanging to realize the fact that we must keep changing the environment. That's who we are. And that realizing that you're actually in touch with something more real than trying to say, because I think anytime you get to a point where people aren't advancing or feeling like they're improving the environment or things are getting better somehow by their own agency, people tend to become dissatisfied and feel that their lives lack meaning. And I'm wondering if if it really is part of the metaphysical side of meaning making to have the proper relationship to this inherent capacity we have to alter and change the environment. And it's not necessarily, well, maybe it is saying to some extent like it's being dissatisfied with the present and thinking about the future, but on a deep level maybe that's just our nature to some extent. And then in fact that's how we advanced ourselves as a species, was thinking about the concept of the future and being able to coordinate a plan in order to change that, realizing the connection between what you do now and what will happen. And to me, it seems hard to imagine a meaningful society where there's not some kind of focus on the future as well. And there's always going to be tension between focus on the future and focus on the past. And I think the dynamic pull between them is really the engine that drives things. And you would never want one side of that to win out. But it seems like people do feel driven and like their lives have a sense of meaning when they're connected to the future somehow. They're invested in the future. And it's dangerous to fixate on attaining certain outcomes because that creates profound disappointment if those don't come to fruition, especially when it's undertaken on a large scale. But yeah, I think people having a sense of connectedness to the future is important. And I think it's, again, an argument maybe more for the presence of talented generalists in society that can keep that in the proper perspective, the development of our technology in a proper perspective. Mm-hmm. But I would just say that maybe it actually is accepting what is real and unchanging counterintuitively to accept that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I don't want to sound as though I'm not trying to be fuddy. I'm just but I'm trying to say that it isn't a seamless transition to go from what we were saying before to what we're saying now. But I agree. I think it's an advantage that the modern mindset has over the ancient and classical mindset, that the world isn't simply cyclical. You can seriously affect the status quo by what you do. I think, though, this actually does kind of touch on, let me know what you think about this. Does this maybe touch on the nature of wisdom? Because I think the first episode that we were talking about education, you kind of toyed with the idea of bringing in what it would mean, the relation between education and wisdom.
Yeah.
And so far we've spoken a lot about meaning and meaning making and so on, and I think that's important. But I think that maybe if we're kind of juggling this tension between, sort of the meaning, making meaning out of the past, but also making a meaning, literally making meaning by affecting your future, then it seems like wisdom would almost be knowing what things it's feasible to try to change, and what things can't be changed. And knowing how far, because it seems like that could easily go in sort of a fuddy direction by saying, oh, well, you can't change this in society. Right. The aristocratic order is, God intended it that way.
Right. Yeah.
And
perennial danger. Yeah.
The perennial danger is overextending the things it's not feasible to change. Yeah. But I think it's also a perennial danger on the part of revolutionaries to kind of say, no, anything can be changed with usually pretty disastrous effects. It's not everything can be changed, but also some things can be changed, and it seems like the wise person is going to be the one who is sort of willing to kind of be patient with technology, not to not to rule it out outright, but also recognize that there are deep truths, there are deep things about reality that aren't going to go away, no matter how much you improve people's lot, or how much you improve technology to streamline production or whatever. It seems like, and recognizing those things which are going to necessarily influence the meaning under which you live, and kind of shape the meaning under which you live. Like that's ultimately a more important goal, I think, than simply seeking a sense of meaning, and simply seeking to well, let me rephrase that. It seems like everybody, like you were saying, is a meaning maker, but it seems like if wisdom really is actually having if to be wise is to have a grasp of the sort of the bones of the world, sort of the foundational things that kind of, it's like seizing the axis of the world. Everything else is turning around the axis, but the wise person kind of knows the point around which everything is turning. Then it seems like the wise person is also going to shape not only the meaning he makes, but also even the way he seeks to make meaning around that axis.
Sure.
Does that make sense? That's kind of, I just kind of hit on the idea of bringing in wisdom, but I think it actually does relate here. It's just sort of.
I think that's actually really an appropriate place to bring it in. I mean, yeah, I tend to think, I mean, I still don't think I've arrived at a final definition of wisdom, but I think the quality of discernment seems to be paramount. And somebody who is wise is somebody who can discern what is worth keeping, what is worth discarding, what is useful now that won't be useful later, seeing those kind of things. But also, yes, like you said, understanding what it's feasible to change and what isn't. And having the ability to point to and understand all the areas in which that is evident too. Because I think you can kind of see this in the resurgence and interest in myths in the last 5 years or so by guys like Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Pageau. I don't know if you ever watched him, but he discusses myth and symbolism a lot. The return of that and interest in that, I think, is a sign that people are cluing into the fact that there are things that are unchanging, and those type of traditions, and this might be a good way to get into your idea about narrative as well. How to put this? That the recent resurgence and defense of myths as something that actually have something to teach us is a recognition of the things that we can't try to change, namely in that context, aspects of human nature and the human condition. And this often comes up when they discuss the horrors of World War I and World War II, where it seemed like our technological advancement had rapidly outpaced, our moral advancement, and where it seemed like all this brilliant intellectual activity was being put to use to just slaughter countless people and soak Europe in blood. And there was a lot of dismay that, like, we thought we had just gotten beyond human nature. Like, now we're better because we can do these things. But we kind of crashed into the realization that actually, we still have a lot of baggage, and there's a lot of things in the human heart that are not just fixed by better technology. And so, yes, that seems to be one aspect of wisdom, is perhaps a connection to foundational myths and narratives that teach those kind of things that apply to any domain, and technology being one of them. Like, well, don't think that this can change fundamental aspects of our nature. Like, this will always be an element of the human experience. And so don't forget that. Another way, and a darker light to put it, is like, don't forget original sin. Mm-hmm. Which is a mistake. I think whether you want to call it original sin or something else, I think forgetting about that is a very dangerous prospect. And, the more power that the one who forgets has, the more deadly the outcome, oftentimes.
Mm.
So, yeah, I mean, do you want to say something about you're mentioning the role of narrative in this too? I wonder if this would be a good place to get into that. I think myth and foundational narratives would map onto it rather nicely.
Well, just before I do that, I want to make sure I know where we are in the
Yeah.
conversation, because it seems like what we've said is, I was trying to resolve or at least not necessarily resolve, but I was trying to show how, at least in principle, you could balance the tension between sort of the technological. You're literally going to make meaning in the sense of you're going to change the world so that it conforms to a sense that you have of how it ought to be.
Yeah.
How you're going to combine that with the sense that meaning comes from experiencing the world as something given, and you kind of accept that and sort of make yourself a part of the world. I was saying that wisdom is going to be wisdom is going to be the faculty by which you actually accomplish that balance. And what you were saying is that one of the ways that wisdom would go about doing that would be by identifying and emphasizing the things that really are sort of axial in the human heart and in human society, like myths. You were giving the example of myths.
Yeah.
At least the way when I've been talking about narrative, and I think if it's what I'm thinking about, I was also talking about literature before we started the episode. I had kind of been thinking about that in a slightly different context, but it'd be interesting to try to get it in here, because I think that there have been, I mean, people have been seeking wisdom for a long time. And I don't know if people nowadays would think in terms, I haven't heard many people unselfconsciously talk about the pursuit of wisdom nowadays.
Yeah. It's a rare few who use that phrase unironically, but there are some.
There are some, but it seems like it's certainly something you hear about from, it has kind of it's like the word piety. It sounds kind of stuffy. But I think that the predominant way that I'm thinking of that people sought wisdom, I mean, mainly because of the tradition that I was formed in college, of the sort of the Christian Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, which sees wisdom as in so many ways a kind of, it's largely it's a cognitive and deeply analytical approach. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think it's incomplete. I think that the role of experience, because in some ways, if we're talking about the things that are fundamental, that underlie and can't be erased over the course of time and with change, then the only way you're actually going to uncover those is by sort of experiencing change and sort of looking at the changing world and trying to identify what has stayed the same. And I think that it would be difficult to, I mean, I don't know if you can ever say you exhaust. I think you can gain access to those axial things, at least in principle, but I don't think you can ever exhaust your knowledge of axial aspects of human nature.
Yeah.
To say that man is fallen, to say that man is inclined in the direction of evil, that man's will is broken. I can know that, but I don't think I can know every possible permutation of that truth.
Sure, yeah.
But it doesn't mean I don't know it, but it seems like, you can still be gaining wisdom after a whole lifetime. But one of the ways, which I think is an important complement to that kind of analytical approach, and I think even the scientific approach to understanding the world that we have nowadays is an interesting parallel to that kind of Thomistic analytical approach, because it's deeply, modern science, it's not exclusively indebted to logical positivism, but it does bear the mark of positivism, which effectively says that most moral statements and most statements of taste, judgments about taste, about beauty, and so on, are ultimately subjective, in the sense that they don't refer to something in the real world. They only refer to subjective emotional states. So that precisely for that reason, a scientist with a deeply positivist mindset isn't going to turn to intuition, isn't going to turn to literature to try and find the answers. He's going to approach things in a very analytical way, Analysis, though, involves a kind of detachment from time. Like we were talking about way back when, the repeatability of an experiment is what actually makes it reliable. But the very fact that you're talking about something which is repeatable, in a certain sense, kind of pulls it away from the specificity of time. So there's a kind of relation to that analytical sort of scholastic approach, and I think both suffer from the fact that they're insufficiently acquainted with looking at the changing world and trying but intuitively and experientially to sort of uncover what's axial and what's fundamental throughout all of that change. And I think that that's one area where narrative in particular, and literature and art are all crucial, as it trains you to be able to do that with your own experience. Mm-hmm. Which is, I think it's no surprise and no mistake that the two major sort of poles between which Western education oscillated for a long time was sort of the humanist ideal, which you see in someone. I think the Romans had a much more humanist ideal rhetoric and expression and sort of the beauty of the word is something they focus on, whereas I think the sort of Greek philosophy was much more interested in analysis. And I think you can see that sort of, though, oscillating between those two poles right down to the present day. And I think that part of, if wisdom is knowing what's axial in things, then part of the way of acquiring wisdom is going to be studying from the great storytellers who have sort of noticed what's axial in things, and have sort of seen how other things sort of turn around that axis, and narrate that turning in such a way that it reveals what they're turning around. I'm a master rambler, so stop me anytime.
No, I think that's a good way of putting it, and perhaps this kind of be our closing little segment here. I think it's perhaps a good way to frame it is that one way to frame it is that the wise person is one who sees the story that's going on. And part of being involved in a story is anticipating and trying to see where things are going to conclude. Mystery novels make a whole business of that, just engaging your brain and trying to think about where it's going to go. But even a more simple story, you're always anticipating the ending in light of what you're reading now and what you read before. So wisdom would in many ways be the ability to, in the present moment, connect those two frames and see where the threads are going and how they're going to interweave, and without the expectation that you actually know the ending too, because a story doesn't work the same once you know the ending, even though it may be pleasurable to reread it. Like once you know the ending, it's different. And so I think that attitude applied to life would have to be one which always seeks to encompass the principles of everything intellectually, but also recognizes that that is impossible to concretely achieve, and that attitude towards the world pushes things forward, and that it ties to technology in that way, that the newly discovered principles of the specialists can be incorporated within the larger framework and seen in relation to the future as well. Whereas I think that's another problem with specialists is they want to see, oh, we can do this now, and the wise person's job is to, well, 8 steps down the road, it's going to destroy us. And part of that, I think, is the ability to sense the story, and you have to have a sense of what the human story is in order to anticipate what the plot twists in the future will be.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I kind of, to tie it back into the image of the virtual exodus that we started with a couple episodes ago, to a certain extent, because we started with, we kind of abstracted our concept of meaning from what the virtual exodus people are seeking. Yeah. But actually, it's interesting you talk about specialization, because to a certain extent, the people who turn to video games for meaning are almost trying to make a general meaning through a specialized fashion, because it takes a lot to be really, video gamers, like really good video gamers, are extreme specialists.
Yeah, yeah, there.
And
I
it
recall
seems,
there was a friend of mine in school who he was an older student when we were there together, and he told me that in his late teens, early 20s, he was a professional Quake player, which was an early first-person shooter game. And I asked him, like, what did you have to do to be prepared for that? He's like, I played the game deliberate practice 10 hours a day in order to stay sharp. So that's specialization, yes. And he's like,
so
yeah,
it
I have to
almost
dip
seems
that
then
because
like,
it's destroying me.
it almost seems like if you're going to turn the impetus to turn toward, because this also kind of ties in with what we were saying in the second episode about childhood meaning is something which is comparatively easy. If you just do a couple things and you rely on your parents, then it's all there. Whereas again, the video game, the pursuit of meaning in a kind of artificial and virtual setting it sort of replicates that. It's both attempting to make meaning in a specialist's way,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in a certain extent, it's actually not courageous. It's too easily daunted by, because if the goal is to get people to come away from the virtual world and actually seek meaning in the real world, and it seems like what we're saying is meaning can only be sought in the real world if we're willing to do so with courage. Once we grow up and realize that we can't naively depend on the meaning we've inherited, we actually have to make it our own in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need that takes courage. And it kind of, from this episode, it sounds like what we're also saying is that, having to juggle, seeking wisdom as a way of juggling and accomplishing this balance between a focus on the past and a focus on the future. The pursuit of meaning in the real world and the pursuit of wisdom, that's an incredible adventure as well. It's much more adventurous than a video game, precisely because you don't know how it ends. And there are real stakes involved in trying to move the world and move society towards wherever it's going.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's more adventurous, but in order to participate in that adventure, you need to have a healthy appreciation for generality, and you need to be courageous enough to actually pursue it. Just kind of tie things up, because I think that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good spot to finish it up. I like the connection with courage again, and I think narrative is really what introduces that element of it, seeing where the story was going. And this came up in a conversation the other day where I was trying to describe like the emotion that comes with the words like wonder and rare, like what those are, and like what I came up with is like the feeling you get early on if you're reading Lord of the Rings or another fantasy type book, at the point where all the parties come together and agree that they're going on the quest. And there's just kind of always like a stirring there, like, yeah, all right, it's getting started. And you don't know how it's going to end. I think that is kind of where courage comes in, that it stirs your courage a little bit. Like we may all perish in this attempt, but we're going after this wonder, this far off treasure, and we're setting out. And I feel like that's kind of the emotion. That's like the way that courage really can come into play there. And that is precisely the type of feeling that you would want to cultivate through education, is that desire to start the quest, despite not knowing how it's going to end. Because the video game, you can always disengage, even though it may become increasingly harder to do so. You can always just walk away and pull the plug, and it's over. So there's a degree of obvious difference in realness. And I think if people could be made to attach to that feeling of realness, the feeling that there's a genuine quest with stakes and rewards to the pursuit, that would go a long way in reinstating that attitude towards the world. And
because I think that kind of crucial in that is because that I love that emotion you're describing. It's like it's one of the best things about thinking about things is when you finally hit that, you're like, ooh, you fill the glass of wine again. You're like, okay, let's figure this out.
Exactly. It always emerges. Yeah, it always emerges. Yeah.
But it seems like part of the reason that I wanted to talk about education in the first place was that it seems like so many educational directives and assumptions nowadays are directed precisely to demonizing that emotion.
Yeah.
That's going to lead you to somehow you're going to wind up oppressing somebody
Yeah.
or you know, doing something evil by following that emotion. You're like, well, it seems like fundamentally, because I don't want to be too hard on the video gamers, you know,
Yeah.
to a certain
No,
extent, I sympathize with the impetus, but I think that part of the reason we're talking about education is because education needs to be, I think, thought out in a way that it's currently not being thought out, or needs to be rethought out because it's been
yeah.
badly thought out so far.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. You know, if we have to have a bottom line, it seems like education should aim to make possible that experience of wonder, and make possible the actual, like, you know, arming people for the quest, you know, not
Yeah.
knowing how it's going to end, but saying it's worthwhile to go on this quest and it's worthwhile to suffer to see it through.
Yeah, and all that I think comes from the ability to see stories in the things that are happening. Because I think, just as a closing comment, this is something that I've heard people talk about in connection to the opioid crisis and the despair crisis that is going on in a lot of rural America. And there was a psychologist who was suggesting that one factor, due to the material poverty that people were growing up in, there was a consequent lack of ability to generate stories. And he thought that the education system, combined with poverty, people just couldn't fashion a story for their life, and so couldn't really muster what I think is that emotion to go on the quest. They don't have the ability to see things that way, and that leads to many deaths of despair, the inability to cultivate a story. So I think that maybe at the root of what arouses that emotion is first the ability to see the story, and technology and scientific discoveries emerge as a character in that story. But I think it all starts with the ability to just make a narrative in itself, which I think ties in interestingly with what we talked about last time with early childhood, the ability to fashion a narrative and feel like you were in a narrative of some sort. Yeah.
What would life
I
be without questions?
Right. Famous line. That should be the name of the podcast. What would life be without questions? Cool. Well, I think we'll tie it up there. I think there's more we could do in this series, but I think that's an interesting place to get to at this point. And I don't know. I find it kind of touching that it's coming down to story. I feel like even though I've moved into more like being far more interested and a frequent reader of nonfiction, like I feel like I always do return to found. I think we talked about this last time with like your friend who read Lord of the Rings and that became his moral compass.
What would Aragorn do?
Right. Yeah. I think that is kind of the found. You do need to have that as like a foundational ability that everything else builds on. The ability to have a story and to internalize some of these characters.
It's kind of funny. I've kind of just, you know, as an interesting complement to that, I much more enjoyed nonfiction when I was younger, and generally roll my eyes when I hear people talk about what's the story. But I've been moving more and more in the direction of reading a lot more literature and sort of really thinking much more about the sort of the pursuit of a sense of narrative. So it's kind of interesting that we're kind of slowly switching spots in that respect.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. That could be an episode in itself. I'll speculate on that. That could be a good future episode. But I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you. That was really good. I think that was illuminating. I'll update you as I get more into the Fuller, and we'll see what else he has to say for himself.
Please do.
He's a highly fascinating guy. I think you should look him up.
I will. Sounds interesting.
All right. See you, man.
See you, David.